In recent days, political developments across the Atlantic have drawn renewed attention not because of dramatic announcements, but because of the careful language being used by those in power. When governments choose restraint over confrontation, it often signals that larger strategic calculations are underway. The immediate focus has been London. At Downing Street, during a routine press briefing, the Prime Minister was asked whether the United Kingdom would consider imposing reciprocal or retaliatory trade tariffs on the United States if American tariffs were introduced. The question itself was direct, but the response was notably measured. The Prime Minister made it clear that the UK does not want to pursue retaliatory tariffs and does not wish to escalate trade tensions with Washington. This position was not confined to the briefing room. After the press conference, senior Downing Street officials reiterated the same message privately, confirming that the government's priority remains de-escalation and stability in its economic relationship with the United States. From a factual perspective, this stance aligns with Britain's post-Brexit trade strategy. Since leaving the European Union, the UK has emphasized bilateral engagement and predictability, particularly with key partners such as the United States. Avoiding public trade disputes has been a consistent feature of that approach. However, the British position exists within a broader international environment that is far more complex. Across Europe, there are ongoing discussions within the European Union about how to respond to potential U.S. trade measures. Some policymakers and commentators within the EU argue that failing to respond firmly could weaken Europe's negotiating position. Others caution that escalation risks long-term economic damage. These debates are internal, unresolved, and still largely theoretical. What matters for now is the distinction between discussion and decision. There has been no formal EU announcement of retaliatory tariffs. There has been no coordinated European response implemented. At this stage, governments are outlining preferences rather than executing policy. The UK's position stands apart primarily because it is no longer bound by collective EU trade decisions. Since Brexit, Britain has regained the legal authority to determine its own trade responses. That independence allows London to choose restraint, even if Brussels ultimately opts for a firmer stance. This difference has prompted commentary suggesting a potential divergence between the UK and the EU. While such a divergence is possible, it is important not to overstate its significance. Divergent trade positions among allies are not unusual, and they do not automatically signal diplomatic rupture. Yet this is where the narrative surrounding these developments begins to change. Some commentators have characterized the moment as extraordinary, arguing that critical shifts are occurring beneath the surface. This language reflects interpretation rather than confirmed change. It suggests that routine diplomatic positioning may be connected to deeper political transformations elsewhere, particularly in the United States. To understand why that interpretation has gained traction, it is necessary to look beyond trade and toward the broader political climate in Washington. In the United States, discussions about governance, institutional norms, and political power have intensified over recent years. These discussions did not begin recently, nor are they confined to any single administration. They reflect long-standing concerns about polarization, trust in institutions, and the boundaries between political leadership and independent state structures. Former military officers and national security officials have occasionally entered this debate, offering perspectives shaped by decades of service. Some have raised concerns about rhetoric, leadership style, and the strain placed on institutions during periods of heightened political conflict. These statements are part of the public record and have been widely reported over time. However, accuracy requires careful framing. While individual former officials have expressed criticism, there is no verified evidence of a unified or coordinated declaration by senior military leadership asserting that the United States has already crossed into authoritarian rule. Such portrayals often emerge from aggregated commentary rather than formal consensus. This distinction is not a matter of semantics. It goes to the heart of responsible analysis. Individual warnings, even from highly experienced figures, do not constitute institutional findings. They represent professional judgment, not collective verdict. Political analysts and constitutional scholars have long emphasized that democratic systems rarely fail abruptly. Instead, they weaken gradually through the erosion of norms rather than the violation of laws. These scholars focus on patterns rather than isolated events. Increasing polarization, diminished trust, politicization of neutral institutions, and the weakening of informal safeguards that support democratic governance. These concerns are analytical, not predictive. They are designed to identify risk, not to announce outcome. One area where there is little disagreement, however, concerns the formal structure of civil-military relations in the United States. Members of the U.S. Armed Forces swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution. They do not swear loyalty to any individual leader. This principle is foundational and remains unchanged. The constitutional framework governing the military establishes clear boundaries. Lawful orders must be followed. Unlawful or unconstitutional orders must be refused. This balance is central to civilian control of the military while preventing its misuse. Importantly, this framework remains in place. There has been no formal alteration to the military oath, no legal restructuring of command obligations, and no institutional abandonment of constitutional norms within the armed forces. Despite this, some narratives suggest that these safeguards are under imminent threat. Claims of widespread purges, enforced loyalty, or systemic transformation of the military into a political instrument circulate widely in commentary. At present, these claims are speculative. They describe potential futures rather than documented realities. Speculation plays a role in political analysis, but it must be clearly distinguished from evidence. When hypothetical scenarios are presented as existing conditions, analytical clarity is lost. The same caution applies to the language of warning. Former officials raising concerns are not issuing judicial rulings or intelligence assessments. They are offering informed perspectives based on experience. Their warnings are intended to prompt vigilance, not panic. This distinction matters because democracies rely not only on institutions, but on public understanding. Overstating risk can be as damaging as ignoring it. When audiences are told that collapse is inevitable, they may disengage rather than respond constructively. At this point, several facts remain clear. Trade relations between the UK and the United States are stable. Diplomatic communication continues. European discussions remain unresolved. Institutional debates within the United States are ongoing, but incomplete. What does not exist is definitive proof of immediate systemic breakdown. That absence does not eliminate risk, but it does frame it correctly. This moment, then, is best understood as one of tension rather than transformation. Governments are positioning themselves, analysts are debating trajectories, former officials are issuing warnings rooted in concern rather than certainty. Understanding where facts end and interpretation begins is essential before drawing broader conclusions. Without that clarity, complex developments risk being reduced to simplified narratives that obscure more than they explain. This foundation matters because future analysis depends on it. Only by establishing what is known can we evaluate what is feared. And only by separating evidence from speculation can we assess what may come next. As the conversation moves beyond immediate policy decisions, attention increasingly turns to why a growing number of experts and former officials believe the current moment deserves closer scrutiny. These concerns are not rooted in a single event, but in patterns that have developed over time and now appear to be converging. Political systems rarely generate alarm because of one isolated action. Instead, concern emerges when multiple pressures begin to reinforce each other. In the United States, analysts point to a political environment that has become unusually polarized, where institutional norms that once operated quietly in the background are now openly contested. One of the central issues experts highlight is the changing relationship between political leadership and long-standing institutions. Democracies depend not only on written laws, but on unwritten rules. Restraint, mutual tolerance, and respect for independent bodies. When these informal norms weaken, institutions can remain legally intact while functionally strained. Former officials who have served across different administrations often describe this phase as the most dangerous, precisely because it is subtle. There are no tanks in the streets, no suspended constitutions, no formal declarations of emergency rule. Instead, pressure accumulates gradually, normalizing behavior that would once have been considered exceptional. Within this context, civil-military relations attract particular attention. The military occupies a unique position in any democratic system. It holds immense power, but is designed to operate under strict constitutional and civilian control. That balance depends not only on law, but on culture, on the shared understanding that the armed forces serve the state, not the political ambitions of any individual leader. Experts note that when political rhetoric increasingly frames loyalty in personal rather than institutional terms, tension inevitably follows. This does not require explicit orders or structural changes. Even repeated public criticism of military leaders or suggestions that disagreement equals disloyalty can alter incentives within hierarchical organizations. This is where many former officials place their concern. They do not argue that the military has already abandoned constitutional norms. Rather, they warn that sustained pressure can reshape behavior over time. Officers who observe colleagues being publicly criticized or removed may become more cautious, less willing to offer dissenting advice, even when that advice is professionally necessary. Such dynamics are difficult to measure, but they are well documented in political science research. Studies of democratic backsliding consistently show that institutions often adapt to political pressure long before they collapse. Compliance replaces resistance not because the law has changed, but because the cost of disagreement rises. Another area experts focus on is the expanding use of emergency language in everyday political debate. When leaders frequently describe opponents as existential threats or internal enemies, it reshapes how power is justified. Actions that might once have been questioned become framed as necessary for national survival. This rhetorical shift matters because it lowers the threshold for extraordinary measures. If political conflict is defined as an emergency, then emergency powers begin to appear reasonable. Analysts emphasize that democracies erode not when emergency tools exist, but when their use becomes routine. Former national security officials often point to this pattern when expressing concern. Their warnings are less about specific policies and more about the cumulative effect of language, pressure, and precedent. Each step may appear defensible on its own, but together they can alter the operating environment of democratic governance. Importantly, experts also stress what these concerns do not mean. They are not claims that the United States has ceased to be a democracy. They are not declarations that constitutional order has collapsed. Instead, they are assessments of risk, indicators that guardrails are being tested more frequently and more aggressively than in the past. Historical comparisons are often raised at this stage, sometimes carelessly. Responsible analysts are cautious about drawing direct parallels. The United States has unique institutional strengths, including an independent judiciary, a decentralized federal system, and a professional military tradition deeply rooted in constitutional loyalty. These features provide resilience. At the same time, resilience does not imply immunity. Democracies with strong institutions can still weaken if enough stress is applied over time. Experts emphasize that no single safeguard is sufficient on its own. Stability depends on multiple institutions functioning together, supported by public trust. This is why warnings from former officials tend to emphasize vigilance rather than prediction. Their concern is that public debate has shifted toward absolutes, either total alarm or total dismissal. Neither response is productive. Alarm can paralyze, while dismissal can blind societies to gradual change. From this perspective, expert concern functions as an early warning system. It is meant to prompt discussion, oversight, and accountability before irreversible damage occurs. The goal is not to claim inevitability, but to preserve choice. It is also worth noting that many experts deliberately frame their concerns in cautious language. They speak of trajectories, risks, and pressures rather than outcomes. When their statements are condensed into headlines or social media clips, nuance is often lost, and caution is mistaken for certainty. This process can unintentionally amplify fear. Viewers may be left with the impression that collapse is imminent, even when the original analysis argued precisely the opposite, that there is still time to reinforce norms and institutions. At this stage, the core of expert concern can be summarized simply. Democratic systems rely on more than elections. They rely on restraint, respect for institutional boundaries, and acceptance of limits on power. When those elements are consistently challenged, the system becomes more fragile, even if it continues to function. That fragility does not guarantee failure. It signals vulnerability. Understanding this distinction is essential as the conversation moves forward. The presence of concern does not mean the absence of stability. It means stability is being tested. As political debate continues to intensify, the role of experts and former officials becomes increasingly controversial. Some view their warnings as necessary. Others see them as overstated or politically motivated. Both perspectives exist, and both shape public perception. What remains clear is that these warnings are not about a single leader or a single policy. They are about how power is exercised, how dissent is treated, and how institutions respond under pressure. Those questions transcend individual political cycles. As we move forward, the challenge will be determining whether these concerns translate into concrete institutional change or remain part of a broader, unresolved debate. That question leads directly to the final layer of this analysis: the warnings raised by former officials themselves, and how those warnings should be interpreted. What does not exist is definitive proof of immediate systemic breakdown. That absence does not eliminate risk, but it does frame it correctly. This moment, then, is best understood as one of tension rather than transformation. Governments are positioning themselves. Analysts are debating trajectories. Former officials are issuing warnings rooted in concern rather than certainty. Understanding where facts end and interpretation begins is essential before drawing broader conclusions. Without that clarity, complex developments risk being reduced to simplified narratives that obscure more than they explain. This foundation matters because future analysis depends on it. Only by establishing what is known can we evaluate what is feared, and only by separating evidence from speculation can we assess what may come next. As the discussion reaches its most consequential layer, attention naturally turns to the voices that carry institutional memory, former officials who have operated inside the system and understand both its strengths and its vulnerabilities. Their warnings are often the most debated, not because they are necessarily the most extreme, but because they challenge assumptions about permanence and stability. These individuals are not outsiders. Many held senior positions in national security, defense, intelligence, and the judiciary. They participated in crisis management, constitutional decision-making, and the quiet enforcement of norms that rarely make headlines. When such figures express concern, analysts argue, it is not the tone that matters most, but the reasoning behind it. A recurring theme in these warnings is the distinction between legality and legitimacy. Former officials frequently emphasize that systems can remain legal while becoming less legitimate in practice. Courts may still function, elections may still be held, and laws may still be enforced. Yet public trust can erode if outcomes are perceived as politically predetermined or selectively applied. This erosion, they argue, is particularly dangerous because it is difficult to reverse. Trust accumulates slowly and dissipates quickly. Once citizens begin to doubt the neutrality of institutions, even correct decisions can be dismissed as biased. Over time, legitimacy becomes harder to restore, regardless of legal compliance. Another concern raised by former officials centers on precedent. In government, precedent shapes behavior as much as statute. Actions taken during moments of intense political pressure can redefine what future leaders consider acceptable. What begins as an exception gradually becomes an option and eventually a norm. Former attorneys general and constitutional scholars often frame this as a warning about permission structures. When leaders push boundaries without consequence, they implicitly grant permission for others to do the same. The danger, they note, is not limited to one administration or ideology. Precedents outlive the circumstances that created them. National security veterans frequently highlight a similar dynamic in crisis governance. Emergency authorities are designed for rare situations, but once invoked, they tend to expand. Officials who have worked through past crises caution that the greatest risk lies not in the initial use of extraordinary powers, but in their normalization. They point out that societies often accept expanded authority during perceived threats, only to discover later that temporary measures have become permanent features. Rolling back such powers is historically far more difficult than granting them. A particularly sensitive area in former officials' warnings involves the politicization of expertise. When professional assessments are publicly dismissed or reframed as partisan, the incentive structure for experts changes. Instead of providing independent analysis, officials may begin to tailor advice to anticipated political reactions. This phenomenon does not require direct censorship. Subtle signals are often enough. When officials see colleagues sidelined, attacked, or publicly undermined, they adjust behavior accordingly. Over time, this self-censorship can degrade decision-making quality, even while formal processes remain intact. Former intelligence and defense officials stress that this degradation is rarely visible in real time. Decisions still occur, briefings are still delivered, and operations continue. The difference lies in what is no longer said. Warnings softened, risks underemphasized, alternatives left unexplored. Another warning consistently raised involves the personalization of power. Democratic systems are designed to distribute authority across institutions, not concentrated around individuals. When loyalty to a person begins to overshadow loyalty to an office or constitution, institutional balance weakens. Former officials often speak carefully on this point, aware of how easily such statements can be politicized. Their argument is structural rather than personal. Systems built to withstand individual failure become vulnerable when individuals are positioned as indispensable. This leads to a broader concern about succession and continuity. Stable democracies assume leadership turnover. When political narratives frame leadership change as catastrophic or illegitimate, the system's ability to absorb transition is reduced. Former officials warn that this mindset transforms routine political processes into existential battles. At this stage, critics frequently accuse former officials of exaggeration or self-interest. Some argue that warnings are driven by personal grievances, institutional conservatism, or resistance to change. These critiques are not dismissed outright by serious analysts. Instead, they are incorporated into the evaluation. Credibility matters. Not every warning carries equal weight. Analysts assess the consistency of officials' past positions, their proximity to events, and whether their concerns align with observable patterns rather than speculative outcomes. In many cases, warnings gain strength not from dramatic language, but from their convergence across ideological lines. One of the most striking features of recent warnings is precisely this convergence. Former officials from different administrations, parties, and professional backgrounds often raise similar structural concerns, even while disagreeing sharply on policy. This overlap is what draws attention. At the same time, these officials frequently emphasize restraint in their conclusions. They avoid predicting collapse or authoritarian takeover. Instead, they speak in terms of probability, stress, and risk management. Their objective is not to forecast failure, but to reduce the likelihood of it. This distinction is critical. Warnings are not declarations of destiny. They are interventions intended to preserve options. Former officials argue that acknowledging risk early is a sign of strength, not weakness. They also stress that outcomes remain contingent. Institutions respond to pressure, but they also adapt. Public engagement, judicial independence, legislative oversight, and professional norms still exert influence. The future is not pre-written. What ultimately emerges from these warnings is not a single conclusion, but a framework for interpretation. Democracies are not static. They require maintenance. When pressure increases, maintenance becomes more visible and more contested. From this perspective, the current moment is neither a crisis nor a non-event. It is a stress test. Stress tests do not predict collapse. They reveal weaknesses. What matters is how those weaknesses are addressed. Former officials consistently return to this point. Their concern is not about fear, but about complacency. Systems fail not only when attacked, but when assumptions go unchallenged. As the debate continues, the public is left with a choice in how to interpret these warnings. They can be dismissed as alarmist, they can be amplified into panic, or they can be treated as cautionary signals, prompts for scrutiny, accountability, and institutional reinforcement. The most consequential outcome, analysts suggest, lies not in the warnings themselves, but in the response to them. Democracies endure not because they never face strain, but because they respond to strain with adaptation rather than denial. In the end, this conversation is less about predicting what will happen and more about clarifying what is at stake. Power, once normalized beyond constraint, is difficult to reclaim. Trust, once eroded, is difficult to restore. That is why former officials speak now, not because outcomes are inevitable, but because they are still preventable. And that distinction may be the most important warning of all. What does not exist is definitive proof of immediate systemic breakdown. That absence does not eliminate risk, but it does frame it correctly. This moment, then, is best understood as one of tension rather than transformation. Governments are positioning themselves. Analysts are debating trajectories. Former officials are issuing warnings rooted in concern rather than certainty. Understanding where facts end and interpretation begins is essential before drawing broader conclusions. Without that clarity, complex developments risk being reduced to simplified narratives that obscure more than they explain. This foundation matters because future analysis depends on it. Only by establishing what is known can we evaluate what is feared, and only by separating evidence from speculation can we assess what may come next.